Okay, so for our last video before the midterm, we're going to be talking about argument forms. We've been talking a lot about truth tables lately. Now we're going to be looking at the ways in which arguments work together in basic functional form. So really what we should be noticing in this particular video is that there are certain ways of constructing arguments that are valid and certain ways that are invalid. These are forms of argument that you can see all over the place, that since I've been studying, I see in the way in which people talk and discourse all the time now. I also use in my own discourse and construction of arguments and conversation and everything. Okay, so what these are our argument forms. So what I've done is I've blocked off our invalid argument forms right here. We'll talk about those last. Our argument forms are going to go right here. And the first and most important, your bread and butter of all argument forms is modus ponens. Now, modus ponens is the inferential rule that underlies all of logic. Everything that we do in logic in this class, at least in the deductive portion, is to determine the strength and play and use of modus ponens. And it is if P then Q, P therefore Q. It's just the way that the conditional works. That if we have a conditional and we meet the condition, you get the conclusion. Now modus tollens is an inversion of modus ponens. It's what we call the contrapositive. That's not a term that you have to know, but just in case you're curious. Modus tollens is the contrapositive of modus ponens, that we get the same conditional if P then Q, we get not Q, therefore not P. So what this is telling us is that Q is a condition of P, that if there's P, then there's Q, but there's not Q, and because there's not a Q, that means that there couldn't have been a P to have caused it, because if there were a Q, then P would have caused it, right? Okay, so that's modus tollens. P then Q, not Q, therefore not P. We have our disjunctive syllogism, which uses the disjunction, which is that either P or Q, it's not the case that P, therefore Q. And we can switch this. Either P or Q, not Q instead of not P, therefore P. So really what this is saying is that either it's 1 or it's 2, it's not 2, therefore it's 1. Or the other way around, either it's 1 or 2, it's not 1, therefore it's 2. Simple enough. We have hypothetical syllogism right here, which is that if P then Q, and if Q then R, then if P then R. And for those of us who've taken math courses before, hopefully all of us have taken enough math to know this much, is that this represents the transitive property as it shows itself in mathematics. That if A, then B, then C, then if A, then C, right? So what we get is if P then Q, and if Q then R, if we get P, then we get Q, and likewise if we have Q, then we get R, so we can just take out this middle step. If we get P, then we get R. This is our hypothetical syllogism. Sorry about the cut. I got another phone call. I got to turn my phone on airplane mode when I record these things so that it doesn't do that. But anyways, we just did hypothetical syllogism. We're on to our constructive and destructive dilemmas. And these dilemmas are going to play upon our disjunctive syllogism and likewise on modus tollens, modus ponens. Okay, so our constructive dilemma says that if P then Q and if R then S, right? This is our first premise. Our second premise is either P or R. So what we get is either P or R, which are the two antecedents of our conjoined conditionals here, then either Q or S. So the constructive dilemma tells us that we have one of the two antecedents. Therefore, given our first premise, we're going to have one of the two consequence. Because if one of these is true, then one of the consequence will be true. And thus, we have our constructive dilemma. Now, the destructive dilemma is very similar, except it uses negation. And the destructive dilemma goes something like this. It says, if P, then Q, and if R, then S, very much like the constructive dilemma. If not Q or not S, right? So what we're doing is we're negating the consequence. Then it's not the case that P, or it's not the case that R. So similarly, what we've done is we've negated the consequence, which shows us that either we're going to negate one of the two antecedents, or perhaps even both, which is just like we learned in modus tollens, that if we get a negation of the consequent, then we get a negation of the antecedent, and over here we're negating one of our two consequents, or perhaps both. Therefore, we're going to negate one of our two, or perhaps both, of our antecedents. So these are our main argument forms. These show up everywhere, and hopefully they show up more as you learn them and use them and take them out into the world. These are tools that you can use to construct great arguments that you will hopefully use in the paper assignment coming up, and will, again, memorize for the midterm, which more information will be posted about on the 18th, and the midterm will be posted for sure and available to be done on the 19th, but be sure to read the announcement as it's written and posted so that you know what you should be doing and how you should be doing it in order to be as successful as possible for the midterm. So again, these are argument forms, and that is the last video for this series on our deductive logic section. And before the midterm, what we're going to be moving on to in the next section of the course is inductive logic and decision theory.